All right. So we got a full class. Welcome, everybody. All right.
Yes.
So I'll get back into that share. Pardon me 1 second. All right. So what's the difference between model versus license? So, my description here is that a business model is really the description of the type of business that you intend to operate. It might be a type of business segment like, you know, um, a cafe and uh, a steakhouse are both restaurants if they serve food and beverage, but they're segments within that restaurant um, category. There are subsegments, and one person is saying, "Well, I'm going to really operate like a cafe. We're going to have coffee. We're going to have some light snacks, and et cetera, et cetera." Um, so you're going to identify a little more specifics about what type of business within a given industry. And then you're also really at the very basics. This came up a little bit at the end of last class, talking about if your mission is kind of what you're there, why to exist, and what you're there to do, what your purpose is. And part of the question was, yeah, but what about how are you going to make money? To me, that starts coming here when you start describing, and here's where I see the opportunity for this to work, where people are going to pay for this service. It's going to happen this way. We're going to offer this product. How does it work? Who are you going to sell it to? Um, so if you start going down that line, I can even hear myself saying, well, so here's where you plan. So what's the difference from a model and a business plan? And to me, all of this is sort of um, debatable and semantics at times. But to me, a business plan is where you really start getting into the details, and start getting into budgets and pricing and breaking down the pieces. The business model is a little bit more the cocktail sketch of, I see this opportunity, and something that you could describe more briefly, and it sort of leans towards the vision where it's a little more narrative, but it's not necessarily um, driven by tense like present, past, or future. Um, it's a little bit more of just a flow chart describing the schematics of how you think it's going to work. And then we already talked about mission. That's sort of why you exist. The strategy and business plan are sort of very similar to one another. And vision, to me, as we described it last week, and as we're going to talk about with this week's assignment, is really looking ahead and saying, here's how I see this model working, serving this mission, and as a result of my strategy and planning, this is what it's going to look like in a year, in 5 years, at some forward point. And so that's what you direct your strategy to execute. So, why is it important to talk about the difference between model and license? Well, a license is what you're allowed to do, what your governing body has stipulated that you are um, qualified and prepared and authorized to do. Now, alcohol production, like I mentioned, is more robust than others. There's higher tax implications. There's a drinking age. There's a lot of reporting about where is the alcohol. There's bonds involved because there's a tax liability that is significant. Um, so it's just something to be aware of, is that we are in a very licensed environment. Our customers are in a licensed environment. So especially if you set aside the modern models of breweries and distilleries, including tasting rooms where we sell to the public directly. So, prior to the last 10 and 20 years, you're talking about a model that says a brewery or distillery would only sell to a distributor who has a distributor's license, and they only sell to retailers who have a retail license. So you think about it's not just your license. It's that now you're also regulated to determine that you are selling to the appropriate people, and a producer could be in trouble if they sold to a non-licensed wholesaler. So it's complex, and it's important to understand what you can and can't do. Which is pretty much that next point. So what a license does is specify and stipulate what you can and can't do. Now, let's see, this next point, different categories of licenses may or may not be available and may or may not be available to overlap or be held concurrently. So for instance, if I own in Michigan, if I own a brew pub license, which has a Class C liquor license, I'm not allowed to also own a brewer or microbrewer's license that does not engage with a Class C license. They don't want a blending of those, even though both of those are on the same producer tier. And we're going to talk about tiers next week, but the 3 tiers are producer, distributor, retailer. And so historically, there's cautionary and restrictive barriers especially between the first 2 tiers of producer and wholesaler and retailer. They don't want somebody playing on both sides of that fence. They want one to sell to the other. So if you have one, there are examples where holding one license may prevent you from holding another. Certain restrictions could happen to you from where your business is or where you want it to be, meaning a township or a county may have rules that are additional or prevent a certain type of license. Or they may say, no, I don't want a production brewery here, but we'll allow a brew pub. So all this stuff is sort of, at least on this slide, is just a bit of a cautionary tale that the license is what's allowed, and it's not always black and white, and there may be more than one. The business model is a descriptive target of what you want to accomplish.
So the licenses that you get, if you were to go into like a brew pub and you're brewing and you got the tasting room and serving food and stuff like that, if you had like a distillery and also distilling like spirits, they don't want those things to cross you. Is that what I'm?
Well, so it would depend on I think right now what I'll say is the cautionary tale is that it would depend on where you are, what state you're in, and you'd have to investigate that. And there have been changes over the years. So right now in Michigan, a brewer can also hold a distiller's license. But I don't believe a brew pub could. That's actually a question I don't have the answer to, but I don't see brew pubs owning them. But actually, no, they couldn't. So if you think about the tiers being producer, for now, let's talk about the first tier producer and the third tier retailer. So what they don't want is a commingling of those. So if I'm a maker, I'm a brewer, I'm supposed to be selling to the retailer, and they don't want you selling to yourself in that way. And so a brewer being a producer can have a concurrent producer license. A brewer can get a winery license. A brewer can get a distiller's license. So you could be, one maker might be able to make 3 different things and hold 3 different licenses. But that's different than saying, and I want to be a retailer. Right? And so that's where, and we'll get, if this doesn't get answered as we go through this, bring it back up. I think we're going to flush this out as we get into the next slides.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm just trying to think if I'm making both, could I sell it out of my place or?
Yes. And so that's what will get explained here in a second. But so right now I'm just kind of describing the landscape of like the business model. You can describe all you want. And then your job is to figure out, well, am I allowed to do that? And do I need to make adjustments or changes, or do I need to try to change the law, or do I need to, but they're 2 different sides of your brain. And there's sort of 2 different sides of the landscape. And so at this stage, it's just important to understand that, hey, these are different lists. One allows for more sort of dreaming and wish listing and wouldn't it be great if. The other one is saying, under current law, you are or are not allowed to do X. And so it's important to know which is which.
Thank you.
So some more details on model versus license. So we kind of covered this. So the model is really connecting to the mission and vision, that descriptive part, and like your imagined or real goals. And the license is going to help you frame your strategy. So what do I need to do to bring this to light? When you get to business planning, versus visioning, now you got to really start talking about, well, I got to list which license I need to own or hold, and which ones might be a challenge or might not, or what order do they go in, and relating to federal and state, et cetera. And it's the first of many structures that an idea is going to have to navigate through to come to life. So I like thinking of it as a sequence, even though sometimes once your business is going, or if you're entering an existing business, the chicken and the egg story starts to become irrelevant because they're happening simultaneously. But I do still think that one way to understand it is sequencing, is that what you want and how to do it are a good way to make sense of this. Now, what I mean a little bit by chicken and the egg is that either could be first, either could inspire or even clarify an opportunity. If you think about 1992 is when there was a significant shift in Michigan law, because it was when microbrewer and brew pub licenses were introduced. Prior to that, there was one brewer's license, and it was allowed, brewers' licenses were allowed to distribute by themselves without having to assign to a distributor, but they were not allowed to sell beer by the glass. No tasting rooms prior to 1992. So that is a significant challenge for a small brewer. Now, we're going to cover some stories here about life pre-1992 for a brewery in Michigan in a second. But what I want to say about either can be first is that there are a lot of breweries that opened in 95 and 96 and 97. That those breweries opened in response to a shift in licensing, saying, I see an opportunity because now a license exists. So they're still fitting into an existing structure, but they were inspired by the presence of that structure, if that makes sense, where the breweries that were open pre-92 were having to fit in the old structure, and then we're pushing for this revision. So we have examples of both in the state. When you talk about the difference between model and license, we have models that were pushing for change in the license, and then a similar model that opened in response to that license. Is that making sense?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to share snippets of 3 videos and a little just sort of self-disclosure. So these are excerpts from both the Great Beer State podcast, which I produce with the Michigan Brewers Guild, and these are interviews that the Great Beer State podcast featured that were excerpts from the book project that I was involved with, The Rising Tide, where we were telling the story of Michigan brewing community and Michigan and the formation of the Michigan Brewers Guild through individual makers telling their stories. So I thought, I've got these snippets, and this document is hyperlinked, so you'll be able to go see the YouTube videos later. But I'm going to play a few minutes of each of these stories because they're describing the time leading up to 1992. And I want you to think about, how does this relate to this whole idea of model versus license? So this will take me just a second to stop the share and then start the share. So Ted is first. So fill in some blanks from that fateful bike ride and cold beer on a hot day to having a brewery in Chelsea.
Well,
What did that look like?
I had been married in 1975.
So just to set this up a little bit, I don't know that I cut out some of the setup. So Chelsea Ale House was the first, brewing license in Michigan that was open for 2 years. And he had just told the story of his engaging in home brewing, and now he's continuing from that.
And at that time, I worked on a dairy farm. And my partner and I, Gordon Averill, well, not partner, he was the farmer and I was the, I'd get out there and slop in the morning. And, so I'd stop by his place every once in a while, and I brought him some of my homebrewed beer, and he said, hey, why don't we just brew some out here at the farm for home consumption? And because you can brew 100, I believe it's still 100 gallons per capita per person per year for home brewing, and the maximum of 200. So we figured, well, we're pretty close to within the limits.
Yeah.
And we bought a lot of malt syrup and started brewing from extracts out there on the farm. And that was the time when it was the Say Yes to Michigan campaign. Like nowadays, a lot of dairy farms were going out of business. And Gordy, 5th generation dairy farmer, had to sell his farm. And we were looking in the tank one day full of milk. We had just milked the cows, and I, titty dipped with iodine, all the cows, and he's looking in there and kind of shaking his head and saying, I'm going to be losing money on this milk. How can I make a profit at the going price? And I said, well, gee, what if it was filled with beer? And so we said, hey, really, dairy tanks, stainless steel vessels with a compressor unit that can chill and covers, made a really
clean, sanitized.
Yeah. And so we used a couple for fermentation vessel for mash tun and for primary ferment. It turned out really nicely, and I'd serve some beer.
What size tanks for those?
Those are about 110 gallons.
Yeah, so your annual limits
well,
hooked up pretty quick.
One tank. Well, actually, no, these were the ones we used in Chelsea for the, and we got an old restaurant soup kettle that was, I sold it to Larry Bell. It was his first brew kettle. I think it was 15 gallons. And
yeah.
We'd put the modified...
I wrote a lot of copy with that story, so we always said it was 15 gallons.
Yeah. We'd use the modified malts in there for... Well, we'd get out of Fink Brothers in Dundee, Carl and Gary. I think they're still there selling homebrew supplies. And so we would run on down there, and we've started with, just gallons of malt syrup, but we eventually, when we started the brewery, we got 55-gallon drums of Edme or Mutton and Fison or Montmellick, an Irish stout, which is really nice. I mean, you can brew really good beer with extracts.
Yeah.
It doesn't pay nowadays. At the ale house, it's all, everything is mashed. I don't use any extract.
So what year did you open the brewery?
It was 1981 when we incorporated, and we were licensed in September of 1982. And so we were the first.
So it was a year in planning, and the landscape had to be Stroh, Frankenmuth. Anybody else?
Heilman used to have a factory, but they moved on out. We were one of 3 breweries in Michigan.
Yeah, and amongst those models, you're converting dairy tanks and starting on a scale that is not even like perceptible to those other breweries, right? I mean, so what was it like even applying for the license? Had anybody? I mean, did Did they even fathom what the hell you're talking about?
That we got a nice letter from the federal government that said basically starting a brewery is an enterprise that takes considerable capital, and a kind of beware letter, because nobody had licensed a brewery in 37 years in the state of Michigan.
Wow.
New brewery. And so, in fact, we had...
So that's the 40s.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, the laws were from 1933, repeal of prohibition.
I mean, 37 from 82 is 45, right?
Yeah.
So that's only 12 years after the repeal of prohibition was the last time they issued a license. Prior to real ale company.
So things were really locked in, and of course we have. I'm kind of a beer philosopher when it comes to it, and there was a. May I diverge for just
Please.
a moment? Okay. There was a Mr. Moskowitz who I heard a summary of his TED talk, and he was employed by Prego to make spaghetti sauce, and his degree was in perfection of product recipes to compete with Ragu, which had most of the market. And so he started out by, they had questionnaires asking people what kind of spaghetti sauce they liked. And people would check off, I like thick and chunky, like, this and that, or these herbs. And then he did taste testings in 10 different cities throughout the United States, and he found that what they put down for a taste test, it's like BJCP. You can describe what you think a beer should taste like. Yeah. I want this, but until you taste them. And he found that the results from the tastings were completely different, radically different from what they'd put down on paper, because you have to go by taste.
Yeah.
And from 1933 on into our era, in the 1980s, and up until the revolution really started in the 1990 or so, the idea was that there is the perfect beer. I mean, taste light, less filling, or whatever, and all but it was American light lager.
And it was narrowing beer. It to an example of a beer.
One category. In all beer, let's say over 90% of the beer sold in the United States was light lager beer. Kind of out of the wrong end of a horse in my book, but we're trying to improve that idea with this historic recipe. And so what we have now, Mr. Moskowitz came up with the idea of a vertical spectrum. There is no greatest spaghetti sauce in the world. There are different types of spaghetti sauces that appeal to different people, and the same applies to beer.
Yeah. So how old were you when you... All right, so that's Ted Badgerow, who, again, if you relate this not only to the interesting story and colorful personality, but if you can imagine what that was, I mean, a home brewer starting a brewery, and nobody had done it before, in the state at least. You also got to witness how fast I can subtract 37 from whatever year it was. But I just found that fascinating that he had an idea. He's talking about this idea that there's different types of beer, comparing to this Prego idea of taste and flavor. And so, but he's having to create a model that's not really defined in license or in category or in existing segment. So that's just something to consider. And now we'll go on to the next story, which is a portion of it's a very small portion of the Bell story prior to really opening the brewery. So here we go.
I opened the homebrew store in '83. and selling stock, and then doing experimental brewing for CalSec with their hop products and getting their backing. And so then the brewery opens in September of '85 with the 15-gallon soup pot. There was $32,000 in stock and a $7,000 loan from the bank.
Wow. And so that had to be kind of wild. Like, how did your small operation provide? You must have provided either scale or perspective or testing ground that. What was your value to CalSec in terms of, were you providing an environment and a size that they didn't have or an experience?
CalSec was trying to work with Boots the chemist in England, who sold homebrew kits, and they were working on a little hop oil packet.
Mm-hmm.
So I would make a control batch and then a batch dosed with their hop oil, because this is exactly what they were trying to do, is put this into homebrew kits and build that business. And so we'd go out and do tastings out there, but then I would bring along some of my beers as well, and sort of had a taste panel going there, and I could get feedback on the beers that I was doing.
Yeah, that's pretty good for both sides. They need a home brewer.
Yeah.
You need a little, you need some customers and projects. So you.
You're muted.
We don't see, I just wanted to point out some interesting parts about that. We don't see Boots the Chemist kits out there making it big right now. So the existing model at the time was like, let's supply the home brewers with ready-made doses to make reliable beer. And here's Larry wanting to make a brewery, but he's operating a homebrew supply shop. And then home brewing trials for a spice extract company. So just that relationship of the vision of what I want, the business model that I want to create, and how I need to exist in the current marketplace between licensing and market segment and whatever's available to me. And so there, a homebrew supply shop was Test Brewing, which then opened a brewery prior to the brew pub licensing, and then the tasting room happened. So, and there's more on that story there. But I thought that was a really interesting tidbit for today's class. And we'll share one more story here, which is John Lenardo's. I think he sets up most of his stuff, but he is Motor City Beer Works in Detroit. But he's going to talk about some of the origin story of pre-Motor City Beer Works. So here is John.
Actually got into it at the professional level, kind of, because when I was going to Wayne State, I used to work for the original owner of the Traffic Jam, Ben Edwards.
Uh-huh.
And Ben had, I didn't work in the restaurant, but I would be kind of Ben's, I would do carpentry, I did construction.
Yeah.
And then I also worked on mechanical type things too. And he also had a dairy, so I helped him make cheese. And
were they making beer at that point?
No, no. So with the cheese making, I got an education in processing, right?
Yeah.
The pumps and all that stuff was the same. But he did want to start making beer because he had a bakery, he had a dairy, and he wanted to make beer too. And this was 86, 87. So in 1988, they constructed the shell of what came to be Motor City Brewing Works across the street from the restaurant. So I helped, that's when I met him, was at the tail end of that construction. And then helped him build the building, and then they ran into the law issues. He couldn't operate it because at that time there was no brew pub legislation.
Right.
So,
and there were a couple of young upstart breweries that had happened. One had closed and Bell's was open, but they weren't selling beer to customers by the pint.
right.
Based on the law.
Right.
So, but you only have like 2 breweries that have opened in the last however many years at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
Chelsea, right? Was
Right. Yeah. That's Ted was telling us that story.
Yeah.
He closed in #84. Larry opens in '85. But
and Ben tried to open in '88.
yeah. But he's building this with the idea. I'm assuming that his restaurant model is going to continue. That he wants to find a way to sell it to the consumer directly. Is that
Right. He
true?
never wanted to go into distribution
Right.
whatsoever. He wanted to make beer for his
And
customers.
thus that law becomes the big blocker.
Yep. Yeah. He wanted to make beer for the customers, just like he was making cheese for his customers.
Yeah. So then what?
So that's when Tom Burns was reading about this, and who was an attorney who had gone to law school on the West Coast. So he was very well aware of what was happening because he was out there with the beginning of the Boulder Brewing Company and all of that. So when Tom moved back to Detroit, which he was originally from, he came by the restaurant and said, "Hey, I'd like to help you out with this litigation." So that's when, they started trying to get some legislation passed to allow for brew pubs. And of course, that history is pretty well documented.
Yeah.
But when that legislation went through in '92, it didn't help Ben because he had built the brewery across the street. It wasn't under the same roof as the Class C license. So he still couldn't operate it, right? So he got it.
Without getting a whole nother license.
Right, which he couldn't own because you can't have a brewery manufacturer's license and the Class C license.
Yeah.
So he ended up leasing it to Tom, who started Detroit and Mackinac Brewery.
Right.
And Tom really wanted to.
In '92.
Yeah, so it was 1992. And Tom wanted to be a brewer anyway. He was an attorney. He always called himself a recovering attorney.
Yeah.
So at that time, I was getting out of college. So I had already been out, but I was still working for Ben. That was around 91. And then I said, hey, I'm going to go over and help Tom get Detroit and Mackinac going. So I was vice president, and it was Tom's company. And we started Detroit and Mackinac. So we made Canfield Ale and Tom's Irish Red. Those were our first two beers. And then we made the wort for the traffic jam. So Ben still got his brew pub license, but we'd make the wort here, and he would come by in his dairy tanker. We'd pump the wort into the tanker, he'd take it across the street, and he'd ferment it in his cheese vat.
Wow.
So that was the relationship for years until they sold the restaurant. But sadly, Tom had the recurrence of cancer, and we were only into it for about a year and a half. He passed away in '94.
Wow.
So at that point, I had been sidetracked enough. So I said, hey, Ben, how about I take over the lease on the building and start Motor City? So I started Motor City in '94. And in '99, he sold me the real estate, and he retired. And that's when we added the tap room and just kind of kept evolving. So it's been a work in progress for 25 years.
Yeah.
30 years, really.
So those years, were, the landscape had to look entirely different than it did now. So, I don't know, what were your hopes in terms of what did you think was possible?
I thought Ghetto Blaster would take over the world, man.
Yeah.
I was going to be a rock star with my own beer.
I mean, when you're taking that lease over, what was kind of your perspective in terms of what do I got to do to make this work, and what's the big upside?
Yeah, I was an idiot.
Because you weren't quite Ghetto Blaster yet, were you?
No, Ghetto Blaster was '97.
Yeah.
And that was when I realized, I'm stuck in this world. Better figure out a way to have fun. What intrigued me the most was I saw a whole new industry.
Eastern Market.
Right on, for sure. That's what intrigued me the most. I mean, I'm a little different than most brewers in that my first passion was not the beer. It was the industry. I mean, I have tons of passion for our products and our industry and what we create. But that's also from the creative side where I just like to make things. But what I really got excited was, wow, this is the beginning of a whole new industry. Nobody's doing this.
Right.
So that really was what kind of fired my jets.
That also is interesting too, because when you're thinking about this is a whole new industry, that means that new startups and other breweries opening is feeding that, is fuel to that fire rather than, I'm in early. I can be the one that does all this stuff, but I mean, so did that, so from 90, two to say, I don't know, 95, 96, you start seeing a bunch of breweries open. What did that feel like? And was that confirming your belief that, hey, this is starting to go?
There was that. There was also, it was very challenging, so I kind of welcomed some beers so I could commiserate. Yeah, yeah, because it was rough, man. I mean, the industry didn't take hold right away.
Yeah.
The whole reason there's a tap room here at Motor City is because that was my exit strategy. At 1999, I didn't see it happening at all. I was like, there's no way. We'd go into bars and try to hand sell the product, and you'd get we already have a micro beer, it'd be Blue Moon. And that went on for years. It was really, in our backyard, we got a lot of support, but the distributors weren't on board. So yeah, it was affirming, but it was also, it was challenging. So it was cool to have other people that you could relate to. Yeah. And of course, with the guild, everyone was helping each other back in those days too. I was borrowing pumps from Scott King and grain from.
Did you feel like that was present prior to the guild though, or did the act of coming together as a guild, did that help fan those flames?
No, I think that was already there, and the guild came out of that.
And so the guild amplified a sort of helpful, organized, collaborative nature that was there.
Yeah. It was it really, in the beginning days, it was collaborative right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Unmute again.
Oh my goodness, muting when you're used to talking, it's a problem. All right, so that's John Lenardos and Motor City Beer Works and talking about Detroit, Mackinac, and Traffic Jam and Snug. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there in terms of, one, he is talking about how, Traffic Jam and Snug just wanted to make beer for their restaurant. And then even when the new licenses came, they still couldn't because the brewery they'd been building wasn't under their roof and wasn't going to be able to do that. And then there's two adaptations. One is, okay, I'm going to lease that, let somebody else operate the thing we built. But then the transfer of work. So I don't know if that stood out to you guys. There's very few examples of this today, but there are some. But this is amazing how early it was, is that it's not alcohol coming out of the brew house. It's alcohol when it's fermented. So Traffic Jam and Snug can have a brew pub license and not have to buy a brew house if they're buying fermentable wort that then starts fermentation under their license. So we'll talk about bond to bond coming up on some distillery slides. That's where bonded alcohol is sold from one licensed entity to another. In beer, that's not available. Distilling it is. So in other words, Detroit Mackinac couldn't ferment the beer and then sell it to another brewer's license for them to treat it like they made it. So this transfer of wort was the solution there. So you have three different examples really of adapting within an existing marketplace to figure out how to do what they wanted to do. Now, if we go back to the slides here for a second, let me put those back up. You know what? I'm going to do this differently. Pardon me for 1 second. Okay, so we're back here, and I just wanted to make these points clear. An existing model may serve as the opportunity, and then unique approaches, this idea of having your idea first and then figuring out how you're going to make it work. That may create a new format, it may create a new model, and it may require market adaptation. So that can also include some difficulties and some heavy weather while you kind of fight through that change. So while those three stories were all kind of the second example of being newer ideas, I don't want to create the impression that that's required, that every every brewing model needs to be resetting the marketplace or creating new things. It's not necessary for success, but it is certainly where we learn about what's possible, and where we see some really compelling stories in the industry, and where we understand where some of these frameworks came from and how they got shaped. And so even if it's a more subtle version, like maybe your original idea is within the current framework, but as your company gets going, you see something else you want to do. These stories can help you kind of see how you might make change in a marketplace. All right. So in the distilling side of things, I do not have as many fancy videos to share stories, but I will share some from my perspective in how this has existed inside the Michigan distilling industry. So the first model variation, by that I mean, okay, the existing model is there are distillery licenses available. All right. So you're a distiller, which means you're a manufacturer. You make spirits, you sell it to the wholesale trade, who sells it to the retail trade. That's the existing model. The first variation really comes from, what I mean by variation is when they start to operate a little differently, which would include sale by the glass, sale directly to the consumer, maybe a tasting room. And that really, the first example of that is in the winery industry. And I don't have the specifics on it. I'd have to do a little more research for that, but I believe it's in the 70s. And you have distilleries like Black Star Farms. I'm not sure who was first, but they are making a fermentable from grapes that can then be distilled into brandy. And so we have a winery industry that's made up of more small independent makers in this state prior to really having small and independent brewers, because it's a good grape growing region. And so there was an exception on the books, or really there was, I should say, a law on the books that allowed them to distill and sell that product. And I know a little bit about that, and reason that the word is little and not much without the details, because I learned about that really by being at a brewery when we were getting our distiller's license. So at New Holland, we wanted to distill in relationship to an existing model, which was the tasting room of a microbrewer. And the pub, could only sell the alcohol we make. A microbrewer's license would allow you to sell beer by the glass, but only the beer you made. You can't have a Class C license, which allows the sale of any alcohol from any other producer. So in other words, if you want to sell wine, you're going to get a winemaker's license. If you're going to sell spirits, you're going to need a distiller's license. People had done the winemaking license, including us. Distiller's license for us came in 2005. But the only thing we could sell on premise by the glass was brandy. So we were making brandy. We had neutral brandy being, and juniper flavored brandy that was sort of modeling what gin could be like. That was being sold over the bar, while traditional spirits were being made and put in the cellar, but not sold to customers inside. And of course, if you're making whiskey, it's going to need to age for a while. So those things are happening while there's a movement to get the small distiller's license put together. So there was a distilling program at MSU, and I believe Michigan Brewing was working on distillery. There's very few operators, but a couple working on getting that small distiller's license. Grand Traverse is in existence at the time. And so in 2008, they they pass a small distiller's license that allows sale by the glass. So at that point, then regular grain-based spirits, whiskey, gin, vodka of any fermentable is allowed in a small distiller to be sold in a tasting room format or in distribution, etc. Following that, you now see a pretty robust, or at least a growing distilling industry where there are distillers that are simply that. They're a small distiller. They opened when the license existed, so they could create grain-based spirits and sell it over the bar from day one. So again, you see this progression of sort of sequencing of model and idea, and then morphing the regs and industry. But those ideas first had to fit in an existing structure. And there's some links here that you can follow. The MichiganCraftSpirits.com will show you the list of distillers in the state. American Distillers Institute, the ADI, and American Craft Distillers Association are two national organizations that are member driven and will give you a lot of resources in terms of showing who's out there now. Just wanted to share those as resources. But reiterating what we said on the previous slide about sort of some of the chicken and the egg stuff, the takeaway that I have from the story that I got to be part of firsthand was, in order to request a regulatory change, a business may need to exist within the existing structure first. Now, I'm not just talking about you got to start your business to, earlier I was really just describing, in order to start, you've got to start with the existing laws. That's true. But I'm also saying, in order to make change to the laws, there's a much more compelling voice if you're an existing business saying, hey, in order for me to grow, dear legislator, in order for me to grow my distilling business, I could use this modification, and I'm going to be able to add jobs. I'm going to be able to add revenue. I'm going to be able to add tax, whatever. Versus hypothetical, I envision being able to be a small distiller, and once I get started, I would be able to do those things. It's a lot harder. This is sort of a little bit of speculation and perspective versus fact, but I'm just saying, historically, you see existing businesses within a licensure able to modify licenses more than a theoretical startup asking to make change to the laws to accommodate an idea. Does that make sense? Governing body is going to want to reorganize or restructure or issue change in order to promote growth to something existing much more than they will write a ticket to a hypothetical business. So that's, and the distilling industry really across the nation, but the Michigan story is really an example of that.
So are you saying, I'm going to just jump in here, I guess.
Yeah, please.
Are you saying that it's just as you're going along, you get a brewer's license and you want to get into distilling, you're saying it's better, or it's what they do is they normally start to fashion up their distilling process and then ask for permission? Because you're
what I'm saying is that if you had an idea for something you wish distillers could do, and you wanted to present that as change, like, I think the industry should change those rules to accommodate this great idea I have, I'm saying they will hear that much better from an existing distillery than someone who's proposing to be a distillery. Coming in and playing by the rules and establishing yourself as a business gives you a much stronger voice to then change, to then request change to the rules to allow that big idea that you have. So
yeah, you're already in the ball game.
Yeah, you're already in the ball game. And so that's, again, a great place to look at the difference between model and how it relates to your vision, and, license and how it relates to your strategy. So when you're talking about business planning, if you're saying, well, I don't know, I want to do home delivery of spirits. Well, if that's not allowed right now, you can say in 10 years, I want to change the delivery aspect of what the distillery license allows. Well, your first step in your strategy is, I got to be a distiller. And it might be year 9 or year 11. You might not make it during your suspected timeline, but it's going to be down the road where you can start saying, and now let's make a case for modifying the rules. So your vision can hold that space for that big idea of change you want to make. Your strategy has got to build steps towards it. And it starts by existing with and making, being profitable and sustainable within the rules that exist now.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And I'm
Gotcha.
partly illustrating that difference between vision and strategy. And they're related to one another, but they're different things. And, one of the questions last week, Frank, that you asked is about, profitability. And vision can dream prior to knowing how it's going to make money. Strategy figures out how it's going to make money. And making money is how it exists into its second year to start accomplishing some of those things on the wish list, right? So it's required fuel for business. But sometimes the ideas are there prior to you figuring out how it's going to fund itself. Make sense? And
Brad, I guess on that note, I was kind of thinking about that, all week long about this, how do you make money, how much you should make and stuff. And I started thinking that, money is like, it's like the water and we swim in it. And, you have to, I think as a business, you have to decide, are you going to swim in a little lake? Are you going to swim in a stream? Are you going to be in an aquarium? And so, money isn't something that you can own and hold. It's something that you exist in. It's an environment that you have to exist in, and you have to kind of, how much do you need for your particular business? I know that's kind of maybe that's a little bit more on the, left field bleachers, but
yeah, but it's true. And I guess what I'm saying is there's these hemispheres that if you're creating a business, especially, you got to be able to go back and forth between the hemispheres. What do I want to do? What do I see as the dream? Wouldn't it be great ideas? And then breaking it down pragmatically. But is it going to make money? Is it going to make enough money? How much money do I need it to make? Well, I don't know. Are you, how many people are you employing? What do your costs look like? How big, where are you going to be? What are your ambitions? I mean, that sort of, there's just two sides of it, I guess, is what I'm saying. And when you're looking at the existing marketplace, it can be very limiting to ideas when it comes to financials and profitability. It's that if we accepted the norms of 1980s beer world, we would not be paying $10 for a 6-pack of regular flagship craft beer, right? Beer would be under $5 and you wouldn't be able to afford to make any of this. So somebody at some point had to say, I think it can change, and put themselves out there and say, I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to give it a shot. And so, it sort of takes both sides. They still also had to be profitable in order to still be here. And a lot of the early ones aren't, because sometimes the market takes longer than the bleeding edge entrepreneurs have. If you listen to the rest of that Ted Badgerow interview, it's pretty fascinating. He's like, we were getting $25 a case, which was unheard of in the marketplace. Unfortunately, we figured out in year 2 that it took us $26 a case to make it. So like that financial part is definitely essential. But on the other hand, without dreamers and believers like that set aside the market conditions for a second and had this vision, nothing would have ever changed. So, that's just sort of the yin and yang of it all to me. And I have a bit more of that dreamer entrepreneur in my personality, and I injected a lot more of that in this sort of class than a strict MBA probably would. But I think when you're talking about a craft marketplace and you're talking about an industry that's had a renaissance, it doesn't happen without that energy, because the brewing and distilling world is not making widgets. Where, no offense to the widget industry, but it includes this different level of different appetite for risk and change and growth, including changing the marketplace. But it came out of, a marketplace that at once was very stagnant. And so this last point on this slide is that is kind of illustrating what we're talking about, that an adventurous vision is going to require some strategy for the before times. So like, okay, pardon me, that's what I'm talking about, is like, how are you going to survive until you're able to change the marketplace? And if you whether your strategy was sound when you start or whether you adapt quickly. If you're able to figure that out, you get to stay at the table, is my poker analogy. And then when things come in, when your big hand comes in, you're able to be there to capitalize on it. Okay, this looks like a lot of stuff here. So brewery models. What I wanted to talk about here is, I've looked at this different ways, and a lot of people will list this, and I just started dropping ideas of like, what are the things breweries can offer? And we'll get to licenses later, but in general, nationwide, I also want to remind you that one of the more confusing parts of licensing and model is that the nomenclature is often using the same words. So there's a brew pub license, but there's also this general brew pub model, which means you're selling beer in the tasting room, which looks like a restaurant. So is it a restaurant? Is it a brew pub? Is it a tasting room? It's whatever the customer calls it, unless you're talking about licensing. And then Michigan has a brew pub license, but Illinois may or may not. So it's just important to recognize that when we're in model, we're talking about words that might be interchangeable and called different things by different people. So to me, I've just divided this loosely into two halves. You have brew pub, which means tasting room driven. You have brewery, which may or may not have a tasting room. It might have a separate production brewery. Are they distributing? And if they're distributing, are they self-distributing? If they're distributing, is it local, is it regional, or is it national? These are ideas that you can put, whether it exists in the business right now or not. If I'm creating a vision for my brewery, I'm imagining, of course, I don't have it set up this way, but like I'm almost imagining like these little tick boxes that you could click on and they'd highlight, like, what are the things you want to include? What's not on here that you want to include? This is part of figuring out what your offerings are, considering all the different ways that people operate within the business that you're talking about going into. Tours was a late addition to this because I can just remember people weren't focusing on tours. And I remember driving that, my own initiative was I want to create a tour program. People want to see these breweries. We need to offer these more regularly. We may need to sell them so that they can get more out of it. So we can have tour staff. And now that's a common thing. But if you don't identify it as something you want to include as your offering, it's probably not going to get any focus. And so these can come later, or you can start with them. So whether or not you're talking about vision or strategy is really a matter of, is this something you hope to do, or is this something you're going to do right now? Or, in order to get started. So in other words, you can almost highlight these different colors like, well, I want to be in regional distribution, but I'm going to start out locally with self-distribution and, tasting room or no tasting room. There's opportunity for retail margins in the tasting room, but then you need staff and you need to be open more days of the week, more hours in the week, and you've got to have glassware. And there's all these things that start to pop up in strategy, but you don't start to deal with them until you identify whether or not you want to offer them. Can you envision doing it? On the brew pub side, and most in this state, in order to be a brew pub, you've got to sell food. But in other states, the brew pub may be a model that's just something a brewer license is able to offer, and you may not need a kitchen. So kitchen or not, if you're going to do a kitchen, is it going to be like sandwiches and pizza, or are you going to have a chef making dinners and entrees, and you're really driving that sort of marketplace? Are you going to have counter service, or are you going to do table service? If you offer counter service in a brewery, expect me to be frustrated when I go there. But that's a sidebar. If you're a brew pub, are you going to be draft only? Are you going to sell beer to go? If so, are you going to have growlers or crowlers or a canning line? You get the idea. You can go down through this whole thing. If you're a brew pub and have a Class C license, are you going to sell guest taps or not have guest taps? Are you going to get a winemaker's license? Are you going to, on a brew pub, we'll cover this in licensing, you have a Class C license, so you're able to buy wine from distribution or spirits from distribution. Do you want to offer them? Do you not want to offer them? Those questions are part of both vision and strategy, depending on when you're planning on deploying them. But all of them are important to ask yourself in terms of creating a vision and then creating a plan to execute it. Because the plan for a national distributing brewery with multiple tasting rooms is significantly different than a, you know, local self-distributed brewery or a brew pub with sandwiches and pizza and guest taps. Does that make sense? Again, we're kind of talking about how do you move from one hemisphere to the other? How do you move from vision to strategy? Well, by having a vision that you figured out that starts to clarify what are the things that I want. And it's such a much bigger question than, so you want to open a brewery. Another model that didn't fit on that slide is contract brewing. And so, you know, this is a whole nother deal, but I just put contract brewery over here in the same way that we had brewery and brew pub. Is a contract brewery, are they going to maintain their core brands? Meaning, do they exist as a branded brewery? Like, you know, Shell did a lot of contract brewing back in the day. I'm not sure if they still are. They sell their own beers, and then they also would use their, you know, their large historic pre-prohibition regional brewery that also had capacity to make beer for other people. So are you going to maintain your core brands or not, and just contract exclusively? Merchant brewers, I kind of borrowed from the Michigan Craft Distillers page, who were defining a merchant distiller as one who purchases distillate and then packages and sells it as their own. I kind of like that term. So who are the merchant brewers, and is this a part of your vision or not? And people, organizations find themselves in this role either as a cross-segment customer, meaning I own a brew pub, I can't own a manufacturer brewery, but I'd like my beer to be in the marketplace, so I could license my brand name to a manufacturing brewery who would make that beer on my behalf, make it to spec, and deliver it to the marketplace. So Corner Brewing, Arbor Brewing, they are connected breweries in some ways, but they're different licenses. And when Arbor Brewing wanted beer in the marketplace, Corner Brewery made it for them. There's some other examples like that. Or startup transition, meaning I have a vision for being a regional brewer, but I don't have the capital or the resources to, but I have the idea and the recipe. So I'm going to have these guys make my beer, and I'll take it over in a few years. Capacity assist. We grew so fast, we can't make beer fast enough. So I'm going to hire out some of our production to this other brewery who's able to deliver to spec. And then marketing agent is my own made up term, but that idea is, I want to be in the brewing industry, but I don't want to own a brewery. I want to market it. So, you know, Pabst, you know, direct me to the Pabst brewery. They're not brewing. They are selling the Pabst brand and contracting out the brewing. And here are some examples, and I don't think time is going to really let me go through all of this, but Brew Detroit is an existing business model, you know, that's a modern day example of a brewery that was built to be a contract brewer. So they built a lot of capacity and a lot of tools that would let them supply other breweries with beer. Pardon me. I mentioned Shell and I mentioned Pabst already. Sam Adams, their origins were hiring out. They were making their beer at Stroh breweries across the country and elsewhere. And they operated a pub in Boston, and most of their beer was being made at other breweries that had excess capacity. Then they bought a brewery. They're kind of, I would say they were a crossover between marketing agent and startup transition. But they bought a brewery in, I don't know, maybe late 90s, and then transitioned away. Anybody remember Pete's? Pete's Wicked Ale and Sam Adams were basically very similar models, both contract brewing their beer. Pete's didn't buy a brewery, and also eventually was sold and kind of left or at least reduced their presence in the marketplace. FX Matt, Cold Spring, these are, Cold Spring is in Minnesota, FX Matt is in New York. These are old regional breweries that are known, that we don't really know as branded breweries, but are making a lot of beer for other breweries out there. And then I borrowed this snapshot from Growler Mag, who talked about brewing arrangements. So these are, again, just sort of examples that we've talked about that could inform either your strategy of how you're going to accomplish the model, or looking at this and saying, oh, this is an interesting part of the segment that I can see myself doing. So it can go either way, but alternating proprietorship is where a brewery that may need capacity is actually going to take over the license. They're going to bring their license, gets applied to another brewery's building for the day. So in other words, I want to go brew at a New Belgium, but they're going to set aside their license for the hours that I'm there, and my license is going to be responsible for that beer. So that's actually a way to sort of contract equipment versus license. Distributing wort is what we were talking about, where you transfer the wort. Speciation, if you go, you can hear, there's an episode on the Great Beer State podcast with Mitch talking about their model was created on their sour brewery. They want to age beer. So they're having many different breweries make their wort. They ferment it, they blend it, they sour it. And they don't own a brew house. And he talks a lot about how that opportunity was something he saw in the marketplace, and he created a business around it. Gypsy Brewing are brewers as people that, instead of having their own brewing or brewing license, they're gonna come in and basically guest brew at a brewery, and then they'll have some sort of revenue sharing agreement about what to do with that beer that person makes and they sell. So those are all different examples of models in the existing marketplace that can either be a mechanism to help execute an idea or be the idea itself. All right, so if we try to describe this in distilling, distillate producer is maybe a fancy word for distillery. Maybe I should just say distillery there, but I'm kind of talking about the big distillery here. They can be making neutral grain spirit. They can be making aged spirit. Neutral grain spirit, NGS, is a common term you'll hear, but really neutral spirit can be made from grain or fruit or potato. And, looking up neutral spirit, you should look it up for the specifics, but it's very high proof spirit. It's, I think it's 100, it's like 198 or 195 proof. It's like 98% alcohol. So there's very little flavor. There's very little remaining ingredients in it besides alcohol. And then that can be proofed down. So things like vodka and gin require starting at a neutral proof and then being proofed down to palatable. So that neutral is both describing an alcohol level, and then it's also sort of inferring flavor because there's so little of anything else, there's nothing to taste. Anyways, the reason that's there is because a merchant distillery might be buying neutral spirit in order to make something else from it. You can buy neutral spirit and then steep it in botanicals to make gin, and then redistill it and then proof it down, etc. You could buy aged spirit from a distillery. There's a big one in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. MSP. So you could buy bourbon or rye, and then you could blend it. So I bought a little bit of this whiskey, or a little bit of this rye, a little bit of this other recipe rye, and I blended it to make my own version. And then I proofed it down to what I wanted. So I bought it at 115 or 105, and then I proofed it down to 85 because that's where I thought the sweet spot was. So you can be making product with distilled spirits that you purchased versus doing the distillation yourself. Now, in order to do so, you still need a distiller's license, right? And then you can bottle it and sell it as your own. So that process of being a merchant distillery and having spirits go between these two makers is often referred to as bond to bond. It's selling from one license to another prior to crossing that excise tax threshold. And it's also sort of transferring that tax liability. So I'm not intending to teach or dive into there's a lot of nuts and bolts to understanding that. But I did put what is a TTB bond here, because it's a guarantee that you're going to pay the necessary taxes. So you're holding spirits, but they're not tax paid yet. So that would be a bonded warehouse is saying, listen, I'm guaranteeing the government that this product is tax liable and I'm responsible for paying it. And then having a bond is often meaning I have an insurance policy. I have collateral relative to this warehouse of spirits that once I sell it, once it crosses that line in the warehouse, I owe the government taxes. So they want to make sure that you're capable of paying those taxes. And so, this term gets used in a lot of different ways, but in general, it's all relating back to this idea of bonded spirits. And bond to bond is one of the ways we talk about it in both winery and distilling world, because you can buy alcohol sort of behind the producer curtain in those industries, and beer that is not allowed. I would have to double check about the federal requirement on bond to bond and beer, but I'm pretty sure that that it's prohibited on the federal level. So therefore, I don't know that it's available at any state, but it won't be on the test, because don't quote me on it. I'm not sure. But in either case, we're in the distilling side. It is available in distilling, and entire businesses have been built on this existing structure of saying, listen, I want to be a distiller, but I don't have the 10 years or the 6 years or the 5 years or the dollars or the capital to age spirits prior to selling it. So I'm going to start out by buying it. Or maybe I don't ever want to own it. I just want to be a blender. The art is in the blending for some. So that's totally available. And then the small craft distiller, which is identified in some state licensures, some not. But again, if we're on the model side of things, then we're just talking about know it when you see it level of criteria for words. So the small distiller, in some states, the market is allowing tasting rooms, which may or may not have food, may or may not require food, may or may not have tours, may or may not allow free samples. So the idea can be, I envision a boutique distillery with tours and free samples, and then you can go over to the tasting room and get a bite to eat. Well, in some states, that's going to be an idea that's not able to be done right now. So you could then say, well, my strategy is I need to move, or my strategy is I need to open up a full-blown distillery and then appeal for the change. Again, just sort of illustrating how these things can play with one another. If, for instance, you go back to our history lesson, there were distillers that left Pennsylvania and went to Kentucky because life was better for their idea there, because they weren't going to have to pay the excise tax. I mean, it's an interesting example because it wasn't really a legal change, but it was an enforcement change. And I just think I hadn't thought about it before. It's an historical example of a company having an idea that wasn't working where they were, so they picked up and moved to where it did work. Viable, strategic adjustment to a vision. And then this market agent is here, meaning that would be an example of somebody who's saying, I have a great idea for a brand. So I want to make Fred's whiskey, but I don't actually feel like making the whiskey. So I'm going to hire somebody to make it. I'm going to give them the label design. They're going to sell it into distribution, and will divvy up the revenue. So that is also available in spirits. And here's some links here that are both where some of this was sourced from, and some places you can get some more information. So those are some existing models in the distilling side. So now,
I was
go ahead.
Down at South Carolina, Anderson, South Carolina, there's a Palmetto distillery. And I was down there. My sister lives down there anyway. So I went in there and I saw it's a cool building and all that went in. And I got the story on how they became, because it was illegal to distill spirits down there until they came along. They actually had to build a distillery. They had to make their product, which was illegal, and then take it to the state down there to have them okay it for them to actually operate their distillery. They were operating illegally, but asking for permission to do it. They had to build it up first. It was kind of kind of a really cool story. And they make a good product, but that's where, it's, don't ask for permission, just beg for forgiveness kind of a deal thing. And that's how they came about.
Yeah, and so that includes a lot of risk, and it sort of depends on who the entrepreneur is, what the state is, what the risk looks like. Meaning, is that a fine or is it jail? Like, well, knowing that would probably help you gauge which strategy you're going to deploy, and where you might deploy it. So,
yep. From what I understand, they were told they have to make it first, but it's illegal. They had to show them. I mean, it was crazy on how they had to do it. And I mean, yeah, as far as the risk, the capital that they had to put in and the money for the still and everything in the building was, it was a risk, but I mean, it did pay off.
Yeah. And so I think, when you're talking about this in terms of the mission of this class and sort of, which can be, it has a certain degree of wanting to teach those entrepreneurial lessons for somebody who may want to start their own business, which many of you have expressed interest in. And it's also helping, I wanted to illustrate the structure of how you might work within an existing business and understand how things came to be, or understand why certain things aren't or can't be or could be in the future. I mean, understanding that framework helps you also understand, well, what now, what's right for right now. And some of that is risk tolerance. Some of that is personality. Some of that is opportunity, timing. I think it's worth the risk because if we go right now, things are good and we can be first, and there's going to be some reward for being first to market in our town or in our region. So there's lots of different things that it can encourage that strategy. And also, and risk tolerance is a big one of them, meaning not every business, not every business person is cut out to be on that front edge where mistakes, or even not even mistakes, just timing can be the difference of whether you make it or not. Hey, the market wasn't ready to pay that much for beer yet, and you were there and it was great, and you were too early. Usually those people are also what made it available for the next people. And they're the type of people that were willing to brave that weather despite, they were willing or not, they were in a timing where the result wasn't what they wanted. And so people who can see that possibility and still go on are the ones who should be taking that risk. People who say that would be the end of the world for me, I just could not stomach failing or having a business. I don't want to say failing, but I could not stomach having my business not survive this early stage. Those are decisions that each business person is going to need to make for themselves. Of it's worth it, I'm going to go for it, or you know what? I see this lane available right now that's perfectly legal and established, and I think we could do a great thing. We can differentiate ourselves with this and that part of our business. So I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't need to push for a new model. I see an existing model that lets me do what I want to do. There's still risk. there's still risk in investing money in startup capital for a business and competing out in the marketplace with other similar businesses and just competing for the consumer dollar and their attention and hoping that you're going to be able to make the things you want the way you want them, and have people pay what they need to pay for it to be profitable. So there's risks no matter what. And I think the purpose of this class is sort of setting up moving into regulations in next week and preparing us for getting into figuring out, the business you want to imagine for the sake of this class. So my reason for putting this here is that until you see the landscape, how can you figure out what license you should have? Until you sort of start considering all the different ways you could be a brewer or distiller as a company, or you could be an employee within a brewery or a distillery. You have to sort of take in all the current possibilities and the future possibilities and then start putting together, okay, here's where I want to go and here's why.
Yeah, I think this just gives us like a good general oversight. I go into with what you're saying and what I've been around and talked to some of these different places I've been to. I mean, there's just the time frame of this class just isn't, it does not even near enough to touch everything that you would need to know to start up your brewery. This gives you it's given me a good, so far a good idea, but
yeah.
I mean, as far as competency, me trying to go after something like this, no, I think I'm gonna have to hire somebody.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, if you were going to business school, each one of these weeks might be a class. I don't know, because I went to music school, but the idea is to point out areas of focus that if you don't have the appetite for, or the awareness for, or the curiosity for, then okay, this can help you assemble a team. I need somebody who has this sort of appetite or this sort of ability or approach to figure it out. Or I don't want to be part of that business. That's not me. You know what I want to be? I want to make whiskey every day. I don't want to worry about the business. So I got to find an existing distillery that makes the type of product that I like to make, that's big enough, that's in a business model that's big enough that they have several distillers just making product, because that's what I want to do. So I think that this can be career informing, which includes, I don't want to be a business owner, or I definitely want to be a business owner. So figuring out where you fit, where your ideas fit, to me starts with looking at the industry and what's available right now. And then, yes, in terms of the overarching view of this class, one of my goals is just that you guys have a roadmap of where to go deeper later based on your individual career and business goals.
That pond Frank was talking about is going to have, pond of money is going to have to be a little bit big to, to hold everybody swimming in it.
Well, this is usually where everybody inserts the old joke. The best way to make a small fortune in the brewing or distilling business is to start with a large one.
Fred, at this, I think that one thing that people could consider is to buy an existing business. There's so many places that are, they're basically running insolvent. They're only making 80-90% of their of their costs, and they limp along. People keep putting money into it, but if you could find a business like that, and and you could say, it's like, well, maybe it's the kind of beer you're making, maybe it's the location, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but cash flow, I think, is like, based on my experience, cash flow is king. I mean, if you got money coming in every day, and maybe it's only 80% of your costs, you only have to contribute 20% then. And that's a lot more doable than, contributing, having that startup and maybe 2 or 3 years before you make your first dollar. before any money comes in. It might be 3 years down the road. And, to have that kind of money or access to that kind of funding for the regular, the kind of people that I am, I mean, that's just unreasonable. But if I could find a place that, I could buy the license and, have it established, have money coming in every day, your costs just are significantly lower instead of starting from scratch.
Absolutely. And then your modeling and your visioning is, starts out with, well, my vision is to find a business that looks kind of like this, meaning I like a small pub, I like a big pub, I like one who has a Class C license or doesn't, meaning your visioning could start with a search. And then after acquisition, your visioning turns into, now what can this brewery go to in 5 years? And but you have a history and you have a basis and you have a starting point of you're coming in at whatever point in that, like you have decisions to make in that process too, is like, I want to acquire a brewery and grow their current brand, meaning it's a 10-year-old brand that the community loves and I want to take it from 10 to 20. So I'm going to nurture that brand and just pick it up where it is as an adolescent and take it through college, versus I'm going to buy the equipment and the building and the process, but I want it to become Frank's Brewery. So that brand that it was before is going to get retired, but I'm going to pick up in the same location and plant a new seed and grow a new tree, right? So those are decisions that aren't, neither is right or wrong. Those are decisions that the business person is making. And if your personal vision is saying, I see my business model starting with an acquisition, then that's a great starting point to begin a 10-year vision of saying, so how long do you have to find one? And what's going to be your process? And what is it you're looking for? That becomes like looking for a house. Do I like a porch or not like a porch? Do I want to be in the city or the country? Like, then your visioning starts with that shopping. And, there are breweries and distilleries out there that went through that process just looking for a building. What town do I want to be in? I've got this idea, but I don't know where I want to be. Some of them are saying, I want to be the first brewery in my town. So my roots start the location of my brewery. Now I got to make it happen in this town. Other people don't have that attachment to the location. And when you talk about saying, well, I don't have the attachment to starting the brewery, that's excellent food for thought to begin the process. And that's the beauty of visioning, is that you can write whatever story you can think of. Then you just got to figure out how to make it come to life. So licensing, this is the reality check of, can I do what I need to do? And, we're not going to break down all the rules of each license entirely or anything like that. We don't have time or capacity for it, or probably the attention for it. But I just put the link here to the federal link to where you find the definitions for the licenses. The brewery licenses they're all start at the same link. And there's a couple of different types of distilled spirits licenses, which includes, industrial, where you're not necessarily making beverages. And so you need a federal license, which is through the Tax and Trade Bureau, formerly the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It also is a nod to the history of alcohol, that the first word in your licensing body should tell you a lot, which is tax. That, they're going to trace your ability to track and trace and pay your taxes is essential to alcohol production. Little sidebar there, but then the link to Michigan licensing for brewer, microbrewer, and brew pub, which are the 3 brewing licenses in Michigan. The brewer, all of these have been modified since the early 90s. Brewer used to allow self-distribution and not allow sale on premise by the glass. In 92, they created the microbrewer and brew pub license. They took away self-distribution from any of the 3. They allowed sale of the glass for microbrewer and brew pub. Microbrewers could distribute through distribution channels, but could not purchase alcohol from distribution channels, meaning they can't sell other people's beer or other people's spirits or wine. A brew pub could through the Class C license. So those definitions have been modified by volume and modified by what they're allowed to do. They later added to go to brew pubs, which wasn't there initially. They've raised the limits. They've added limited self-distribution and raised that limit again. Distillers have had less changes, but have had changes. Small distiller mostly didn't exist until 2008, which gave tasting room opportunities. And all of these involve also brewer and small brewer, or distiller and small distiller usually relates to a tax break for the smaller producer as well in terms of excise tax. So, once you start figuring out you want to be, this is where you're going to figure out how you got to be. And I think that's where I'll leave that. Understanding this and looking at this can inspire ideas, meaning I don't want to limit the sequence to one direction. I think I've already said this a few times, but you don't have to start with your big idea and then take it through the rules. You can look at the rules and say, oh, I didn't know they were allowed to do that. Look at that. Nobody's really capitalizing on this thing. Or I see an opportunity in the marketplace that's right here in the code. It says we can do this. So ideas can come from these strange, cold looking places, because figuring out the rules is the best way to figure out how to move through them. And sometimes that jogs. Fresh eyes on this can be really important in the marketplace, because a 10-year-old business is probably not pouring through the licensing rules and the updates and the changes the way a new entrepreneur might be. So just food for thought, that remember to go think of this in both directions. And then your county, city, township, whatever your local ordinances apply, the health department, USDA, zoning, all those change by where you are. So where you are matters. And that's another example of the mountain we have in front of us when you start talking about teaching this sort of class. Is like, I couldn't even imagine taking you through 50 states of state regs, let alone then talking about, well, in Washtenaw County, a brew pub has this extra little thing. I remember being in a zoning meeting here in little Ganges Township about a brewery coming in, and I was there in support just as an audience member, and the planning commission was quoting rules of the license that I just didn't think were true. And stated so. I said, you're putting a regulation on this business that doesn't exist. I'm a member of that licensure. And what I didn't know is that the township had an ordinance that said, well, if we're going to have a microbrewer in our township, then they also, I think it was about food. They were saying they couldn't have food. And I said, I know nothing in the brew pub or in the microbrewer's license that prohibits food. Anyways, that's just my version of a story of like where I was sitting that moment changed that particular rule because that township had their own ordinance. So for a business acquisition, for a business creation, and even if you're bringing a new idea as an employee to a business, sometimes you're gonna need to dig in and figure out where are we and how does it apply to what we're able to do, and can this idea be executed, or do I need to go and ask for change? Meaning planning commissions are the ones who say, okay, I hear what you're saying. We're gonna either change the rule or give you special permission. So that's about all I can handle in licensing. It can be a place that feels, pardon the pun, very taxing because it's rules, it's definitions. There can be contradictions. There can be contradictions between federal, state, local. The wording, some of it was written in 33 and doesn't apply anymore, but it still holds until somebody changes it. So this is a place that can be very difficult and frustrating, but it's a necessary place to understand if you're going to be the business owner or the person responsible for this part of the business. All right, so we got 15 minutes. I'll cover the homework and the assignment here, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So the homework, which is an ungraded assignment that I'd like you to do and still post, but it's really for your own benefit, is write a pro and con list for each license type in Michigan. So, what we're talking about is brewer, microbrewer, brew pub, distiller, small distiller. So it doesn't need to be exhaustive, but I want, instead of just listening to me talk about it, I want you to go to the process of digesting this on your own and saying, okay, well, an advantage to this license is, and a disadvantage is. And so that way you're just getting a grasp for the universe. And then choose a license type and a business model for your kind of what I called semester business. So I just want you to look at that pro and con list and say, you know what? I want to be a small distiller in Michigan, a microbrewer, and imagine that this is going to be something that you're building on for the semester, and then explain why. So just basically have a reason and realize that you're going to live with this for a little bit. It can be the business that you want to do in life. It can be a business you feel like exploring for the sake of it. But choose one and explain why. Then your assignment, which is due next week, is to write a vision. Now, I wrote /creative brief because I like the way those things relate to one another in terms of how I try to explain the purpose of a vision. Maybe it's my branding background, is that if you're going to be working with other people, if you're going to be delegating responsibilities to a team or asking somebody to hiring an agency to do some work for you, if they don't understand the brief, if they don't understand the goal, the creative goal of what you're doing, how are they going to execute? And they're going to come up with their own ideas. And you're going to say, no, you don't understand us. You don't understand what we're trying to do. Well, writing a creative brief is one sort of known entity out there. Before you start the project, you're going to give them a brief. That's the way I like to try to make sense of vision. And it's funny, we talked last week about how so many people teach vision to me backwards. They teach it as a mission, as what you're about. And I just don't understand it. And I talked to Ari from Zingerman's, who teaches vision, who's been teaching vision, writing visions and consulting on it for so long. And we were talking last week because I was mentioning that I've been using his stuff for a couple of different projects lately, and I've been a fan for a long time, but I brought up this class and I just said, I'm digging in. I'm going to, we were talking about quoting his book, and he was just giving me his blessing, and we were lamenting. He's like, I said, my latest homework on vision has me really frustrated seeing how many people use this in the other way. And he said, I just don't understand it. So anyways, we have Ari's blessing to sort of look at it this way. And my words are saying, think of it as a creative brief. You're describing what you see at some point in the future as a target to get to. So your mission is related to your choice in the homework, meaning you choose a license type, you choose a model of your own combination, then pick a time in the future and describe what it looks like. What does it feel like? Who are the customers? What's the experience like? What are the moving parts? What are you making? How are you making money? Where's the money coming from? How big is your team? Who's your team? What does it look like? And so you can say, this is 1 year from now, this is 1 year from licensing. You know, once we open, this is 1 year later, 5 years later, 10 years later. Doesn't matter to me. What matters is that you're going to have an origin story of I'm existing with these. I'm creating a version of my business model, and I'm picking a time in the future, and I'm going to tell you how it's working. And you're going to do that in 500 words or less. And the idea here too is illustrating the difference between mission is 50 words as a couple of sentences, and vision can be a page. And if you were writing a vision, a real vision for a company, you know, it could be longer than 500 words, but it should be sort of digestible in a short story sort of format. So that's the assignment and the homework. We've got 10 minutes left. Comments or questions? Yes, Hannah.
Hi, I have a couple. One's probably more important than the other. So I wanted to know if you had any tips for how to start the process of pushing for legislative change, because there are already some things I kind of want to write to probably my state senator about, but I just didn't know if you had examples of going through the whole process of pushing for something that would make your business or had made your previous endeavors more successful.
Yeah, I think that part of me wants to, I'm going to answer first before knowing the answer, but one of the things would be to specify whether you're speaking personally or as a company, because those approaches may be a little different. You're probably going to be blending both, meaning being personable and relating your personal story while you're representing a business in that request is still good advice. But an existing business petitioning for change might look a little different. And then I would say that usually the first step is educating. So, and I would say it's twofold: making sure you have educated yourself on whatever reasons the existing rules are there for, and really who likes it the way it is, who's going to oppose the change. So in brewery laws, it's usually thinking about wholesalers and then secondary retailers. There's a history behind why that we'll get into more in next week's franchise law class. Distributor association has more power over brewer rules than retailers tend to. So simply understanding if I'm asking for this change, who is it going to affect? Even if I don't think it'll affect them negatively, who's going to think it affects them negatively, so that I can figure out how to navigate that and either lessen that impact or say it shouldn't matter. They're going to have to lump it, right? So you're going to have to, somebody's going to be speaking to the legislator on the other side saying, yeah, but if you give them that, what about us? So like self-distribution, it's always brewers versus wholesalers. And so those changes are usually negotiated before they get to the legislator. And then people are saying, hey, here's how it is now. Hey, legislator that's been in their job for a year, here's this law that's been here for 60, and here's how it works now. Here's how it could work. And here's how it's going to affect these 3 licenses. That education piece is huge, because if you can create a scenario where they look up and say, is everybody in agreement? Everybody nods their head. Looks like I'm supposed to say yes. One of the biggest misperceptions, I think, is that the legislators know why the laws are there and that they know that it's hurting you. There are so many laws, and even a liquor control commissioner may not understand a law that is a thorn in your side that looks so obvious because it's poking you every day. They don't even necessarily know it's the law. Sometimes you bring stuff and say, hey, I don't know if you, and again, going in with an air of curiosity or an explanation versus torches is helpful. Meaning saying, I don't know if you're aware about this, but here's a law and here's how it's impacting me and here's what it's preventing us from doing. So first I want to let you know about it. And then I'd like to talk about whether or not we can strategize change. That's a whole different conversation than I can't believe you are enforcing this law against me, because most of them didn't write the law. And they
Thank you.
don't
That was
know
really
it.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great start. And then this one's, I don't know, not really as practical, but I'm curious. So I know with the 3-tier system, like you know, if you own a brewery, you can't own a tap room that sells a bunch of stuff that you didn't make. What about married couples that can they skirt around that?
Yes, those are the examples. Those are most of the examples on the books. So Arbor has since been sold, but Arbor and Corner Brewing was, I think, the first of its kind that sort of thread that needle. I can't remember if they needed legislative change for that to happen, or if they morphed their situation to accommodate the rules. I think the latter is true. But so Renee Greff owned Arbor Brewing. Matt Greff owned Corner Brewery, which was then licensed to make Arbor Brewing brands for the marketplace. So they were an existing business with a lot of knowledge of and consultation on how to make that work. And I believe they had to, it was like a year-long process for them to figure that out.
Okay.
And then afterwards, other people can kind of take that roadmap and say, oh, we just got to do what they did.
Yeah, there's a couple of businesses that I have in mind, and I was just like, how are they getting away with that? But I guess if it's been done before. So thank you.
Yeah. And like a current example, Brown Iron was going through this right now. They opened under one model, then they wanted to change, and they kind of ran into like, oh, that's not how that's going to work. So there's a few examples like that. And again, that's state specific. So that prohibition may not exist in another state. So sometimes I know as a traveler, or especially in the early days, I'd be like, they'd be putting people into jail for this in Michigan. How is this happening? And it just has to do with how their state laws were written and how their licenses were created. Anybody else?
Fred, kind of following on that, like you're a member of the Brewers Guild, I think it was, and
Yes.
What do they have for lobbyists? Or what do these different associations or whatever? How much do they spend on lobbyists? And I think if you're going to, the professional lobbyists used to be legislatures. They got a lot of contacts and stuff, and is there any way that people like us could become like associate members and be in on what the lobbying effort is? Because I really think if you want to make change, like Hannah was saying, is that there's probably people doing things now, but we may be able to influence the lobbyists and at the association level, and then as they talk to the legislators, they may have an inside track on it that just writing a letter to your state senator wouldn't.
Yeah. So I don't know if this will be encouraging or not, but I'll share the roadmap, which is similar to what we were talking about in terms of being a licensed entity and wanting to make changes. So the Michigan Brewers Guild, and most states have one now. A little history: started out without any political ambitions, meaning it was only marketing because it was the only thing we could agree on. And then we added legislative aspect to our mission later, once we had formed a kind of a cohesive unit. And now they do have a lobbyist that is involved in sort of monitoring rules and managing objectives, meaning what are the things that are on our agenda and what do we got to watch out for when some other organization comes down the pike and wants to change something that's going to affect breweries. You need somebody to sort of catch that. It's not just all initiating change, it's also watching out for change that might negatively affect you. So that's a state organization that's member driven, meaning you need to pay dues to be a member. the changes they're asking for are going to affect everybody, but their voting of the board members is going to happen from members. And typically the legislative agenda would be driven by a board or a committee, depending on the current structure. So part of the story that I wanted to say is that, one, breweries and planning are often allied trade members, meaning they don't have a vote. This particular organization, and I don't know the bylaws for the Michigan Distillers Association as well, but they're probably similar. In order to be a member, you need to be a licensed producer. And so if you're not producing, then you could be an allied trade member. So you don't get a vote, but you can have membership and information, attend meetings and what have you. So that's one of the ways people get a running start, develop relationships, develop an awareness, and get involved prior to having a license. Also, and back in the day, it's how I don't think there are as many now, but we had a few, I guess now what we'd call a merchant brewer that existed, wanted to be a member, wanted to pour at the festival, but if they didn't have a license, they had to be an allied member. And then the producing brewery of that beer was the only way they could come in through the festival. Anyways, that's a sort of adjacent run up to your question, is that I would say as a non-licensed brewery and planning that can't be a full voting member, if you're bringing your agenda item to make legislative change, it's going to have a hard time making the list of an organization that's dealing with hundreds of members and a long list of priorities that probably only the top couple get dealt with, unless there happens to be a curveball in the industry that says, hey, somebody else is making change and it's time to go for number 6, right? So the reason they have a list that might have 8 or 10 objectives is because you never know what's going to become the right time for one of those. It doesn't always go in order. So I will just say that, yes, there's a way to get involved and to start bringing things to their attention. But it doesn't mean that they're going to drop what they're doing and say, we got to address this right away. I just got an email. So one has to really sort of nurture and manifest and take care of their own opportunities. I mean, if it's important to you, you might start with whatever relationships you can muster. And if you get a little momentum on it, either through your representative or through your local government, I don't know what the thing is, but if you're trying to do something that no state brewery is allowed to do, you're going to eventually need the guild on board, and the guild's going to need the wholesalers on board. You're going to need those connectors, but bringing it to them when the idea is a seed is different than bringing it to them when you say, listen, I've got this idea, I've got a business plan, I have funding, and I have a representative ready to sponsor the bill. Can we talk? That might make an agenda, because you're not asking them to do all the heavy lifting for them. You're now bringing something that has a little energy behind it and looking for a collaborator and looking to have cohesiveness in the industry prior to putting it in front of a legislator. So actually having the representative, you don't want them out ahead of you, like trying to present a bill without having talked to the guild, because those things are all going to get bounced out. They're going to, now, I mean, it's a source of pride that I can even say that they won't usually pass legislation without talking to the guild, because that wasn't the case back when I was in those situations myself. Nobody called us. We were getting blindsided left and right. So it took us 10 years to just get a seat at the table where they'd tell us, hey, somebody's proposing a brewery bill. Maybe we should hear your opinion first. That wasn't the case. And so, but I'm saying now that is the case, if you started to get some progress or see something develop, then you'd want to say, hey, Scott and board, I'd like to get your opinion on this. I'd like to have your endorsement prior to getting it put in front of people. So that's a little bit of strategy and a little bit of flow chart of how things would work. A newcomer asking for change is either got to be dealing with for that to be successful, it's either got to be so small and so specific that it really only affects you and nobody cares about it, so you have zero opposition, or it's got to be something that everybody else also wants, and you just happen to be the one who sparks it. Or you see an existing brewery who's trying to make that change, and through conversation, through relationship, you find out about a movement trying to make the change that's going to work for your model, and you attach and say, oh, I learned that this is what everybody wants. So, or it's what this group of brewers already wants. So now all I got to do is stay in touch and maybe either stay tuned and decide to open after that breaks. I'm going to wait until they're successful and make this change, and then I'm going to start my business. This would be one example. Or, hey, I happen to have the resource they're lacking, so I'm going to join that effort but help them out. Those are examples. But if you were a in planning business and you wanted change that nobody else wanted and was going to cause a disturbance in the marketplace, that is a mountain that few successfully climb. So finding the right conditions, or finding a way to be a successful existing enterprise prior to making those requests is sort of the strategy that I see. Anybody else? All right. Well, thanks for the participation. And so you've got the homework and you've got the assignment, and we'll see you next week.
We don't have a quiz this week. Oh.
Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Good night.